Hello, I'm Kevin Taylor and welcome to CIPRtv, a show brought to you in association with Marketeers for DC. Tonight's show looks at the latest developments in the ongoing legal and business battle with the NLA, the Newspaper Licensing Agency, the UK body that operates a licensing service which, on the one hand, aims to ensure all organisations have access to and can share content from newspapers in a way that complies with copyright, and on the other hand, was established to extract payments for that access and distribution. In 2009-10, the NLA introduced a licensing scheme for media monitoring firms that provide links to content on the websites of NLA members. A lengthy legal battle ensued as Meltwater, one of the first firms to introduce this style of service, and the Public Relations Consultants Association challenged, in the simplest of terms, the legality of charging a fee to provide links to material that was available without charge. After a couple of goes around the courts and appeals to the High Court, all of which I have to say broadly sided with the NLA and the right to charge licence fees to those using the material for commercial purposes, the case was finally referred to the Copyright Tribunal, who handed down their interim findings last week. Now, as is often the case in these sorts of disputes, both sides are pretty much on the front foot straight away claiming victory. The NLA because their principle regarding the right to charge fees was again upheld, Meltwater and the PRCA because the tribunal thought the fees proposed to be too high and instructed the NLA to reduce them. Indeed, Meltwater claimed that these reductions will save UK businesses some £100 million over the next 3 years, a figure the NLA of course rejects. And that's where we pick up the story, with the NLA arguing the original publishers are entitled to a fair reward when third parties create a commercial business from their content, a point they say the law agrees with. Meanwhile, with the use of hyperlinked news content a growing part of everyday business and personal activity, many people, including it would appear the Copyright Tribunal, feel the level of fees and the number of people caught in the net to be unjust. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio today to discuss this controversial subject is David Pugh, the Managing Director of the NLA. As usual with CIPRtv, we're giving you the chance to join in too. So if you have a question you'd like to put to David, you can use the submission box on the page or tweet with the hashtag #CIPRtv and we'll do our best to include it in the show. So, David, after all those courtrooms you've been in, this week you came out with a bloodied nose. So tell us why, in an age when newspapers are largely given away free, or an increasing number of them are, and access to the content on websites is largely provided free, you feel there's a need to charge such a far-reaching and costly licence scheme.
Well, as you indicated in your introduction, Kevin, actually what the NLA's web licensing scheme is about principally is obtaining fair reward for newspaper publishers. And again, as you've indicated, aggregators like Meltwater have built very successful business-to-business services using newspaper content. And so our principal objective is to get fair reward for publishers. Probably just worth filling in a little, adding to your background introduction there. The NLA introduced its licences at the beginning of 2010 after 2 years of consultation and negotiation with the media monitoring industry. It's not just about Meltwater, and we engaged with the likes of Gorkana, Precise, Press Data and others. And when we launched or went to launch our licenses in 2010, we had 18 media monitoring companies who were doing pretty much the same thing as Meltwater, using newspaper content, whether it's print edition or web edition, to provide monitoring services, paid for monitoring services to their clients. So the essence of our licensing, it's about a return to publishers. It's business to business. It does not affect consumers in any way. And far from having a bloodied nose, we've now got the the green light to go ahead after the High Court, the Court of Appeal, and now the Copyright Tribunal.
Yeah, you're charging an awful lot less though than you intended to charge, aren't you?
Actually not, and I don't want to get into chest beating and who won and who lost, because actually I think there were many victors from this, and perhaps I'll come back to that. But actually, if you look at the tribunal judgment, it upheld NLA pricing completely for 2010 and 2011, has modified it for, slightly for 2012, and then has proposed a different scale of fee increases from 2012, from 2013 onwards.
I don't want to get into a to and fro about the figures, but speaking with Meltwater earlier today to try to understand their figures, you know, we have this number of 100 million saving over the next 3 years. I listened to how they calculated that. It was based on a sample of their own current customers, extrapolated across their base, and then applied to their share of the market. And 96 million, I think, actually was the figure over a 3-year period. So how come that number is so high? And you think, obviously, it's nowhere near that?
Well, it's given that the Copyright Tribunal took 2 years to build towards, and there were 4,000 pages of evidence. You might imagine it's slightly more complex than this, but if I say this, when we launched our web licensing scheme, the NLA business plan anticipated that we would earn something like 1 million a year, maybe 1.5 to 2, from licensing Meltwater and the other media monitoring companies operating in the UK. The result of the tribunal decision this week is it looks as though that is what we will earn. Now our business plan was based on an assumption that the web monitoring part of the UK monitoring industry was worth about £10 million a year, and the figures we've seen in the tribunal support that, and we also know from the tribunal that Meltwater is about 90% of the market. So we never
think they're 24% of the market or 25% of the market, not 90.
Well, I think again the evidence we saw in the tribunal would dispute that. But again, I think for your viewers, that's not really the point. Whether there's been a breakthrough in economics and somehow the tribunal has ruled that Meltwater will save more money for its customers than the whole market is worth several times over, I don't think is the issue. What your viewers, what PR professionals want to know is, what does it mean for me? Do I need a license, and what's it going to cost?
I mean, the questions are flying in thick and fast on Twitter, and we'll get to one of those in a minute, but the fees you proposed, you say they were modified. I believe the smallest license you were proposing in 2014 would have cost just over £1,000. I think it's 1,076, and the Copyright Tribunal have reduced that to 187. That's almost a tenfold drop in the price you were charging. That's not modifying, David. That's slapping down.
Well, let me explain where we got to and how we created our fee structure. I referred earlier to the 2-year consultation period with the media monitoring industry, which Meltwater was invited to participate in, but didn't. They only engaged with us 3 months before the licenses were due to be finally launched, and when they had been agreed with everybody else. And in those consultations, our starting point was to say that web content would be the same value as print content. A pretty obvious argument, because it costs UK newspapers just as much to create the content, whether it ends up on newsprint or it ends up on the web. And obviously, much of it is used for both purposes. But during the consultation process, it was made from the evidence that companies like Gorkana and Precise gave to us. It was obvious that the number of clients monitoring web and the volume of web content was relatively low, certainly for their businesses at that time, although it has grown substantially over a period of time. And so we agreed that actually we would launch the web licenses for end users at roughly half the price of print, but that we would increase those prices over time with a goal of print and web being valued the same eventually. Now, when Meltwater referred our licenses to the Copyright Tribunal, whose role, by the way, I mean, I don't think many people know what had heard of the Copyright Tribunal probably, but whose role is to decide whether the licenses are fair and reasonable, and principally focusing on price, but also, but not only price. At that point, we couldn't go into a tribunal process with the agreement that we'd had with the market to say we will equalise prices at some point in time when the market will bear it. We had to put out a plan, and so we put a 5-year plan, a negotiating chip, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of when print and web would equalise. That wasn't what we agreed at the beginning with the media monitoring companies, and the tribunal spotted that and endorsed our launch pricing, as I say, for the opening 2 to 3 years. But then what they're really saying is...
the prices are being retrospectively applied, aren't they, from 2010?
That's right. I mean, the licensing scheme came into force in 2010, but as a result of the legal action, we opted not to invoice clients until the tribunal had happened, so that we could invoice at the right price, rather than having to have retrospective discounts. But the reason it's taken so long to get to the tribunal was that wasn't the place to sort out the core legal issues. We'd produced licenses to enable media monitoring companies to scrape web content, copy it, provide paid-for services, and then licenses for their clients to receive those services, just as we do in the print world. But Meltwater was contesting whether they needed a license at all, and contesting that their clients didn't need a license. So we had to then go to the High Court to ask for a declaration on that, which we obviously got. The High Court and the Court of Appeal subsequently declared that licenses were required by companies like Meltwater, companies were required by their clients, and along the way we won some useful victories for publishers, because it was clearly established that online newspaper content does attract copyright protection. Even a headline, even an opening sentence attracts copyright protection, which is useful not just for UK newspaper publishers, but for anybody who's creating content on the web and wants to have their work protected.
I want to get to one of the questions coming in on Twitter. This is from Dan Howe. So Dan, thank you for your question. He asks, how do you reconcile NLA licenses with the various social strategies that your members have developed that encourage people to share content?
Well, I think, again, you've got to clearly differentiate between consumer and business. NLA licenses have nothing to do with consumer activity encouraged by newspapers. Do newspapers like the Telegraph or the Guardian want people to go to their sites? Do they want the traffic? Do they want people to share content with friends? Yes, of course they do. We're talking strictly here about business to business activity, so companies that, like Meltwater, that make money.
So if I can pick you up on that then. So Meltwater, I'll accept your argument, are making money from the content of your publishers, and they provide those links. But those links then are followed to the sites, providing eyeballs on the sites. From, you know, I've sent this story about a housing development to the housing committee at Camden Council, and now 20 members of the housing committee are going to the Daily Telegraph site to read it. That's 20 eyeballs. That's what the Telegraph want. That's not depriving the Telegraph of customers. That's giving them customers. And you know, you're at the Telegraph. You set up the website. You know the business model. The more
Sure.
eyeballs, the more.
Yeah, sure. The problem is with two things here. Firstly, Meltwater doesn't deliver many eyeballs in reality, and the evidence for that came out in the Copyright Tribunal. Not monetizable eyeballs, which is a fairly unpleasant phrase. But again, the other point, is that the business model that a newspaper or any copyright owner wants to employ is the one that should be respected. But in terms of the value, let's address the point about what value does meltwater bring. In the tribunal, it emerged that meltwater sends some 70 million links a year to its client base. That's what they told the tribunal in evidence. They also told the tribunal that of those 70 million links that are sent out there, they result in 94,000 click-throughs a year to newspaper websites. So not the Telegraph alone, but all 1,000 websites that we represent. So monetize that, you can't. Effectively, it's negligible. And the comparable stat.
But raise a license on meltwater, but why raise a license on those people that follow the links? That I have a real issue with. The license will be paid for once, it will be reflected in fees meltwater charges clients.
Well, very simply, I'd like to actually come back to the question that was asked.
Yeah.
But let me just
sorry, Dan.
Let me just address Dan's question in a moment. Very simple. Our licenses are about providing paid-for services and receiving them. Clients pay meltwater. Meltwater has 2,000 clients who pay them for their service. The other monitoring agencies in the UK have about another 5,000 clients who are paying for web monitoring service. They're paying their media monitoring company. All we're asking is for a small percentage of that for the publishers. It's the publisher's content. Again, in the tribunal, the evidence that emerged was that 30% of the content that meltwater sends to clients is from UK newspapers. The other 90% is 60% rather is from other sources.
Well, the voices in my head are telling me that we need to move on because our time is tight today. But
I agree. Can I answer Dan's question?
You can as well. Yes.
Let me do it this way. An awful lot of people are confused, not surprisingly, from the press coverage over the last week. Some of it's been very good and spot on, but there's been quite a lot of confusion about does this now mean that anybody who picks up a browser and looks at the Telegraph website is going to need an NLA license? Again, somebody's sitting in a business, they look at the Telegraph's website. Do they need an NLA license? No. They look at the Telegraph's website and they see something interesting. They send a link to a friend or a colleague. Do you need a license for that? No. You set up a series of Google alerts that are on business subjects, and you receive those. Are we going to be asking for a license for that? No, we're not. So
well,
that probably clears away.
Because I think Google is the elephant in the room, and I think it's fair to say the tribunal was also a little bit confused by your attitude towards Google. I think you specifically differentiated between, as you just said, the forwarding of links and emails with use of Google's business services directly. Now, if meltwater need a license, surely Google need a license. And are you not taking Google on because you think they've got deeper pockets and better lawyers than you, or because you think that if you ask them to pay a license fee to access your members' content, they'll remove your members' content from their search engines, which I'm sure your members don't want?
Okay, well let's talk about Google and the licensing of them, and let's talk about use of Google as well, because I think that's probably more interesting for your members actually. Yeah. But in terms of Google, actually our position has been very clear on this. It's been the same for 2 years, and we again, there was some misreporting of the tribunal. We haven't changed our stance here. We differentiate in our licensing of aggregators, or media monitoring companies, between those providing a paid-for service where the clients pay, and those which include Google, but not only Google, where a service is free to the user. If it's paid for, you need one of our licenses. If it's free, you don't. There was, again, some of the reporting rather naively assumes that UK publishers don't have commercial relationships with Google. The publishers made it very clear to us that we are mandated to license the paid-for sector. The commercial relationship with Google is for them, not for the NLA, which is of course absolutely fine. But anyone who assumes that Associated Newspapers or The Guardian or News International, who all have very clear and different web strategies, anyone who assumes that they don't have a commercial relationship with Google is naive. I mean, the Telegraph until recently had someone from Google on their board, so I would contest that they do have some sort of relationship going on there. I think the more interesting question is does using Google cause a conflict for business users? Are we going to license that? And I think I've just hopefully answered that, really, that we're not seeking to license people for using Google Alerts.
I mean, far be it from you to be wanted to help Meltwater's business, but I can tell you that the biggest barrier they come up to when they're trying to sell their services is that people say, oh no, we do that using Google. So Meltwater are licensed, but Google aren't. Well,
the evidence would be to the contrary, wouldn't it? Meltwater has built a very smart business. It's a £50 million turnover a year globally, approaching £10 million in the UK, 2,000 UK clients. Google doesn't seem to have restricted that growth.
You would contrast that to the size of Google, though, David.
Well, but Google isn't charging.
Elephants and mice would be the. Let's look at the UK as a specific for a moment, and the UK is maybe unique in the news world. We have a publicly funded national broadcaster with one of the best news websites in the world that will always be free to access, and that gives our publishers in the UK a challenge to how they monetize their web content. And I put it to you that I don't think monetizing it via the NLA is the way around the bigger issue they've got of how do they make money from the web.
Oh, I completely agree. Look, the NLA is only one relatively small revenue stream for publishers. If you want to talk about the publisher's business model, go back 25 years, the twin pillars of circulation and advertising revenue very solidly supported all of the newspapers. These days, if you talk to newspaper publishers, of course, those are still the most important. They've now added in web advertising, but they would now have probably 25 revenue streams, including reader offers, database revenues, and a lot of syndication revenues, of which the NLA is only a part. Revenues from licensing their content to LexisNexis, Factiva, licensing use by other secondary publishing houses. So B2B revenues are important to all publishers, although B2C is obviously still their prime revenue stream, but it's tough.
Do you think that every UK business now needs an NLA license?
A large number of UK businesses already have an NLA license. We cover something like, we have 9,000 corporate licenses, and they cover something like 250,000 businesses. Those businesses, the majority of those, probably 85%, certainly by value, have a paid-for media monitoring service.
Do you not think that, you know, in internet-based news content, the genie's out of the bottle, and you're vaguely running around trying to push it back in again to see if we can make some money out of it?
Not at all. I mean, our business model is to work with the market, and that has been the case since we launched in the mid-90s. When the NLA came along, our approach was to look at the media monitoring companies, how they operate, how they were monetizing their services with their clients, and we designed our licensing scheme to fit what they want to do, and that's essentially been our model moving forward now to the web. So one of the things that Meltwater attempted to do in the tribunal and in the court cases was to say that their business is very different from companies like Gulkana or Precise or the others competing in their sector, and actually and to say that actually they're a search engine. Well, no, they're not. They're very clearly competing for the same in the same space as the other paid-for media monitorers, except that they narrowly focus on the web, whereas these other companies embrace print monitoring as well. But if you were to go into their operations and look what they do and what the service direction, yes, that's right. And our whole objective in here is to work with Meltwater. Despite the apparent public battling, we have always worked on the basis that Meltwater will be a client one day, and we want them to be a client, and we want them to have a successful business. We simply want to move them from a parasitic business model to a symbiotic one.
But you also wanted to charge them 10 times, or charge their clients 10 times what the Copyright Tribunal wanted to charge. No,
we didn't. I mean, calculations based on doing everything to the maximum, and the chairman is the seventh son of a seventh son. I'm sorry, don't make sense.
The 187 instead of 1,076 were your numbers for your smallest license.
Yeah, well, as I've explained, we had to put a five-year plan in place for the tribunal. We fully accept the tribunal's verdict, and in terms of winners and losers, I think it's worth remembering there were actually 4 parties in the tribunal. It wasn't just the NLA and Meltwater, and I would argue actually everybody won something there. As far as the NLA is concerned, we have won the point that publishers deserve a fair return. The PRCA sportingly stood in as proxy for clients. Well, they've now got clarity. Licenses are required, and 2 years of uncertainty is over. UCMA, representing the paid-for monitoring companies, well, they've now got a level playing field. They've had perhaps not an elephant, but a competitor in the room that's not paying licenses to publishers and whose clients haven't been licensed. Well, now the playing field is level for them, and I'd also argue that Meltwater won not £100 million. I mean, I think that's just chest beating and not terribly important. But I think what they have won is also some certainty in their business, because if you think about it, they've been operating a business model that's somewhat uncertain. Their key raw material, they haven't had a license to use from publishers. Now, that uncertainty is over in the UK at least, although as the news from Associated Press last week shows, Australia, America, Canada and Norway are another question.
I think the UK is a subject of some focus for this, and the Copyright Tribunal is probably trying to apply a 19th century law to a 21st century problem, but we are where we are, I guess. What I would say is, apologies to all of those looking at us on Twitter, but we have had lots of questions. David has very kindly beforehand agreed that any questions we didn't get to, he would be prepared to answer afterwards in writing, so we'll try and get back to everyone that asked. Thank you very much to, amongst those, Dan Purvis, David Miller and Nikki Alvey for your questions, but that probably is just about all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank you, David, for joining me. Thanks especially to Marketeers 4DC, who do a fine job of producing and enabling these shows. Don't forget, the deadline for the Excellence Awards is Monday, February 27. Find out more about this and the next edition of CIPR TV on the CIPR website. Thanks for joining us.